Ryan Olkey, what's up, brother?
Hey, good to see you.
Good to see you, man. Another episode of Inhabit.
We're back.
We're back, baby. So yeah, I think what we're gonna do today is I feel like I say this every every episode we have. I'm like, we're gonna do something a little special today, but today, guys, is gonna be
keep
really
it special.
It's gonna be really special. It's gonna be so special, in fact, that we've even brought on a special guest. So that's how special this is. So let's get into it. So today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about inhabiting your perspective. A lot of people who watch this show are already pretty familiar with, the Integral Project and some of the major ideas to come out of the Integral Project, such as the 4 quadrants. And one of the questions that I see asked a lot in this space is like, okay, the 4 quadrants are a great sort of cognitive tool that helps me kind of make sense of the world around me. But how does this actually land in my life, right? Like, how do I actually use these quadrants? How do I actually step into these sorts of perspectives to enact my reality? Because it's one thing to sort of look at this as, a bunch of boxes on a piece of paper, right? That have some fairly heavy ideas, some heavy lifting ideas behind them. And it's another to actually sort of practice these perspectives in the moment, take these perspectives on one at a time, and learn how to become just a little bit more familiar with these different kinds of perspectives so that they become that much more intuitive to us. Because I think the basic idea here is that we're actually sort of taking these perspectives and sliding among these perspectives all the time. Just about every single day, we're taking multiple versions of these perspectives. And so what we're going to do today is sort of, something that our guest Bruce described as a perspectival yoga. And I think that's a really, really great frame for what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be taking a perspectival yoga that takes a close, intimate look at the inner and the outer of each of the 4 quadrants. And that sounds like a lot. I mean, that right there is a pretty, sort of cognitive phrasing, the inner and the outer of the 4. What the hell does that mean? We're going to show you what that means. And in fact, what we're going to do is we're actually hopefully going to show you that this is actually a simplicity that is on the other side of a whole lot of complexity. We could sit here and have academic conversations about any of these perspectives all day long if we want to, but we're actually going to sort of, skip that part a little bit. We'll unpack some of this and talk about some of the interesting ideas behind it. But really what we want to do is help folks learn how to identify these perspectives and take them more naturally, more fluidly. So I think that's what we're here today. So let's introduce our guest. Yeah. Okay. We've got Mr. Bruce Alderman. Bruce, it is so awesome to have you on the show today. So you are a professor, you are a longtime integral academic, and you are, just someone who I've been friends with, for almost 20 years now, pretty much since we launched Integral Naked back in 2003. I think you were one of the first people and one of the most prolific people in the integral community, even all the way back then. So it is so awesome to have you here with us today, man.
Hey, great, Corey. Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here. I don't know if I've ever met you in person, but I'm wondering if I did, because when I went to Ken's house, it was right before, like maybe a week before the launch of Integral Naked, and he announced it to us and said that we're about to do this, and if you want to sign up, he gave us the details, and there were other people in the house with him, but I don't know if it was you.
I could have been there. I might not have. I don't know. That was like 20 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
That was a long time ago. No, and it's, yeah. And basically you and I have been, pretty tight online this entire time. And in fact, Bruce, you're sort of the guy I go to when I need someone to check my math. I've got 2 people I look to, and one of them tends to be really, really busy. That's Ken. And then, I have you, and, you actually helped me a lot when I was sort of trying to come up with a way of framing these perspectives. You and I sort of had a lot of back and forth, and it was really helpful. I think it there are certain of these perspectives that I had a hard time, not necessarily taking, but communicating, right? There's a couple little tricky perspectives in here. And through my conversations with you, it became so much more clear, to the point where like some of these perspectives now I'm having a hard time not seeing them. You know what I mean? They're so pervasive. I see them all over the place, and we'll get into some of that shortly. But yeah, I think that this is going to be a very rich and nourishing conversation for all of us. No matter if you are a longtime seasoned integral veteran and you know sort of the academic work inside out, or if you're an integral newcomer and you're just kind of leaning into your curiosity a bit and you want to learn a little bit more about what these perspectives are, how to take them, and sort of how useful they can be in our lives. So I think this is going to be great, and I'm psyched to have you with us, bro.
Thank you. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah. So Ryan, I'm thinking, just a kind of a little bit of an origin story here. So we've done a couple episodes in a row that I, sort of in my mind kind of constellate together. And we started off with, basically using film clips to describe all the major altitudes of consciousness. And then we did a similar episode, but using video games. And these two episodes have been so well received, which is awesome. They seem to be really, really helpful for people because they're giving people very common, ordinary, sort of cultural reference points to make sense of this stuff. And then last month, we did an episode on Inhabit Your Entertainment, where we, again, sort of unpacked this a little bit more and talked about how all of these integral ideas and perspectives can actually give us a more rewarding, satisfying, and fulfilling, really, experience of art, media, entertainment, etc. Today's episode actually grew out of those conversations. So as I was getting ready to, basically write up a piece for the Inhabit Your Entertainment discussion, out popped sort of these 8 perspectives. And it's all framed in terms of how to look at a particular piece of art or a particular object. And I like this frame because I think it helps keep things simple. Because, when you read Ken's writing about these perspectives, about these, they're called zones, it's a lot of heavy lifting stuff. It's deeply cognitive. You have to learn big words like autopoiesis. A little secret, no one knows what autopoiesis means. Now, Bruce knows what autopoiesis means, but it's not a common term, and it's kind of hard to use a term like that to make these perspectives a little bit more friendly, which I think is what we're hopefully going to achieve today, is making these a little bit more friendly, a little bit more accessible to people. So I started sketching out sort of, what happens, what are the different perspectives that we can take on a given work of art. So let's say we put something on the table in front of us, in between us, and we all enact that piece of art or that object or whatever it is. Here are 8 simple ways to enact this work of art that is going to provide more meaning, more insight, more beauty, more connection, and again, just a more fulfilling experience of whatever it happens to be that we're looking at any given moment. So that's kind of where this conversation came from. And in terms of where we go from here, I'm thinking what we do is we just spend a little bit of time describing each zone. Give sort of an experiential view of it. Bruce, I think that you can give us a little bit more of a sort of some academic grounding for how these perspectives are used and how they can be useful for us. And we'll just kind of take it from there. Does that sound good, guys?
Sounds good to me.
Word. All right. Well, let's start sort of where everybody starts, in the upper left quadrant. Yeah. So the upper left quadrant, the basic idea here is that all of these quadrants have an inner and an outer. And what that simply means is we can look at each of these quadrants from a first person point of view or from a third person point of view. So let's talk about what that means in terms of the upper left quadrant, which is the quadrant of our interior individual consciousness. Well, if we're looking at a piece of art, I think that there's 2 things that really sort of get lit up for us, which is, the first one is zone 1, the inner of the upper left. What does that mean? That basically just means my actual phenomenological experience, the states of consciousness that I feel, sort of the emotional states that I feel, whatever sort of the contents of your awareness are as you're engaging with a work of art. So a common question that we would ask ourselves, a zone 1 question that we would ask ourselves is, what is my immediate in the moment experience of this artwork? What emotional or spiritual states is it evoking for me? So does that make sense why that is a first person? It's technically a first person view of our first person, right? Which again is a bit of a mouthful, but I want to make this a little bit more intuitive for people. So right now, as people are watching us, and I'll let you guys unpack this in a sec. Right now, as people are watching us, they're having an experience, right? And part of that experience comes from whatever we happen to be talking about. Part of that experience comes from whatever the, surrounding, whatever moods and attitudes and all that people arrive to this conversation with. But right now, you're feeling something. Maybe you're feeling confused about the conversation. Maybe you're feeling excited to understand more. Maybe you're feeling a little bit cranky because you didn't get enough sleep last night, or you had too much sugar yesterday, or whatever it is. All of this is leaving a phenomenological sort of experience that you can register right now in the moment. And the same is true when we're watching art or looking at art, engaging art.
Bruce, feel free to, I jibber jabber here all the time, so feel free to chime in with your thoughts on zone one.
I was thinking really it makes sense to get a good sense for zone one in contrast with zone two, in the sense that one, when we're talking about taking the first person and third person perspectives, I find that it sometimes even though that's technically correct, it sometimes leads into confusion if we really want to keep it simple. I just say the inside and the outside of the interiors and exteriors, right? And which you've already said. But just doing that, it keeps it simpler. When you start getting into the third person, it's a little bit harder to track, in my opinion, sometimes, especially if you want to keep it really intuitive. But
yeah,
in terms of the first person, the inside of the interior, basically you don't have to do anything special to get there, right? In a way, that's immediately presenting itself. And that's why I wanted to contrast it with zone two, is that you do have to do something a little bit special in order to be able to pick up on the outside of the interior. And so I can say something now, or you can, but I think you'll unpack it too as you get into that. The shorthand part of that is just synchronically, right now, in immediate time and immediate presence, we're in the inside of the interior, right? That's what we're experiencing immediately. We only really get a sense for the outside of the interior diachronically, across time. We've got to kind of be able to notice trend lines in pattern, in experience over time. And then that helps us pick up on patterns and structures and things like that. So you can't very easily just sit here and get your outside of your interior.
right.
You need to, you can engage in some thoughtful reflection or read your journals or things like that, but there's some extra steps needed.
Right.
Yeah, I think it makes sense too, Bruce, about contrasting these two, because as I think about it, I'm contrasting them already in my head in order to talk about both of them. So if we can just, I don't know if we just do that.
Do you guys want me to get through zone two and then we can unpack?
Yeah, sure. I think that would make sense in this one. Yeah,
totally. So if zone one is the inner of the upper left, again, our immediate direct experience right now, then zone two involves some of the sort of unconscious factors that we have, that we all possess. So zone two would be noticing the shapes and the patterns of mind, right? That actually determine how we think or feel about the art. So it's not just what we think or feel, it's sort of what are the containers, what are the unconscious psychological containers that influence and give shape to our experience in the moment. So this involves things like, what stages, what intelligences are, this particular piece of artwork or this object, what are they lighting up for me? What shadows are getting triggered for me when I'm looking at a particular piece of art? So that's basically it. What stages, intelligence, typology, shadows, etc., is this artwork lighting up within me? So for me, one of the easy ways that I can sort of distinguish between zone one and zone two, our immediate experience versus sort of our structures, our structural aspects to our consciousness, is it's really states and stages, right? I mean, our states of consciousness are all zone one experiences. They're all sort of undeniably real right now in the moment, right? Whereas our structures of consciousness, as Ken often says, we can't see these things from sitting on a cushion. We can't see these things from, any number of these sort of, consciousness focused practices that we might have. It actually requires another perspective in order to sort of look at our interiors and track them over time. So basically, zone 1 is what's conscious to us at any given moment. And then zone 2 is sort of this big ocean of our individual unconscious. And I think the idea here is that art can light both of these up at the same time. I mean, our most direct experience of art is obviously going to be a zone 1 experience. That's what presents itself to us. We have a reaction in the moment to a piece of art. But then if we sit with that reaction a little bit more, we can sort of get a sense of, what are the shapes of mind that are causing this reaction, that are allowing this reaction to sort of emerge at this moment right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I was thinking, because I tend to work with people, in training groups and then private sessions, and mostly in the realm of meditation and Dharma, but also we do, over at Buddhist Geek School, we have our integral Dharma trainings. So I'm always looking at it from that perspective of like working with somebody. And from, the waking up perspective, zone 1 is just like that thing of constantly saying you don't have to do anything in order to have this direct experience of awareness, of presence, but what we do is we turn it into kind of a zone 2-ish kind of thing. It's funny, is like we're relating to it as this object that we're trying to see, and then you have to give that up in order to be able to directly see it. But then on the other hand, in terms of like cleaning up, it's actually noting over and over again what's happening in that zone 1 to be able to expose the patterns in zone 2, whether they're trauma patterns, or even deeper in a certain way that's harder to see those structures, and that's even trickier though still too to this day. I've not really seen techniques that are just overwhelmingly the ticket in order to reliably, consistently, predictably do XYZ, and then you'll expose your current level of development. But, like with Robert Keegan's work of writing down the assumptions you have about reality and then reality testing them is sort of like that. Like, well, here's what I know, my direct experience. And now I'm going to try to take a step back and look at those things and see if I notice a pattern. And in this context, we're talking about art, which is really interesting. So, we talk about art bringing us into a very direct experience. Rothko is obviously one of the very popular artists, almost maybe go so popular to a cliche sense, like maybe Target's printing up Rothko's, I don't know, but still really profound artist that like was all about invoking state experiences, immediately, directly. But it's interesting to look at art as helping us notice patterns. And, Corey, to your point of like looking at an artist like Trent Reznor, takes a long arc to look at an artist and see how they're going through their process, and then how might that process affect us as we're listening and growing with that art. And I imagine, if you're listening to Nine Inch Nails and all of a sudden they, you put out a new album that's a little deeper, and you're like, that might jolt something. Like, wait a minute, what? I thought we were just gonna be pissed off and at the world, and now you're not. Like, what the hell? And maybe that will evoke an awareness of the outer of in zone 2. Well, so my initial thoughts.
Yeah, great thoughts. Bruce, do you have any comments you want to share?
Yeah, I thought that was great. And I was just going to ask what you feel just about the general distinction between the I and the me, in that, the zone 1 is the I and the me is more like the distal self, which is your past self. And sometimes art can invoke, immediate feelings, but art can also bring up perfume clouds from your past selves, and really, help you see, yourself in different periods, or, important stages that you've inhabited before. David Bohm says that we're always living, not only are we thinking, we're always living in a cloud of thoughts and felts, these kind of echoes of things that we've felt and thought before that just keep repeating.
Right.
And so some art, especially some postmodern art, I think really tries to poke at that and point to kind of the habitual subjectivities that we all inhabit, which could be zone 2 kind of apprehension.
Yeah, no, that's beautifully said. And it's an interesting point because, I differentiate between sort of an immediate aesthetic experience, right, that I'm having from a given work of art versus something that I might just call my overall tastes, right? And my tastes aren't necessarily defined by my sort of direct phenomenological experience. Like I might have tastes for types of art that make me uncomfortable in my immediate experience, but like there's something about it that resonates. There's something about the cosmic address of this piece of art, its zone 2 cosmic address, resonates for whatever reason with mine. And it can go the other way too. Like I know that there is media, there are entire genres of media that I tend to avoid because it triggers zone 2 shadow material for me, right? I don't like heavy sort of or horror movies or things like that, because they're triggering a heaviness that is already that I already have wrapped up in shadow within my own zone 2 based on my own personal experience. So I can feel an avoidance there because there are certain kinds of art that just don't land in my zone 2 very well. So I push it away and I tend to avoid it. And Ryan, I loved your point about cleaning up, because it's really interesting, right? Where the path of waking up is largely a zone 1 sort of set of practices. The path of growing up is largely a zone 2 set of practices. But cleaning up sort of sits right on this line, because cleaning up is when we're taking material, unconscious material, out of zone 2. We're bringing it into zone 1, making it an object of consciousness, right? But actually sort of re-internalizing it and then putting it away, right? And we kind of put it back into the zone 2 background, where hopefully it's not going to sabotage us as much, or it's not going to inflict as much pain.
Well, and we one way to say is we have more available for zone 1 experiences actually when we reintegrate unconscious parts of ourselves. There's more fullness in zone 1. And actually, in this arc of art and the other episodes we've done, and in Inhabit, we've always been leaning towards something embodied, grounded, practical, so that way we can really live, everything we talk about integral. And I think art actually is one of the best, examples or tools for growing up, because it's just so hard to see. And especially as adults. So Ken, I think he gives an example of for child development about one day you just stop playing with those toys, you move on kind of thing. But as adults, it starts appearing like it's just one continuous, unchanging journey. Like we've arrived, and this is how psychology in the past has treated adult development. But you can easily look. I mean, for me, going back through music and movies and television shows through the last 20 years and see what was I really into at that time, and then what's my experience of it now. And if I go, ugh, I don't want to watch this. Like, why? Why? It's like, oh, well, because I was acting out my shadows that I hadn't integrated yet, or because I was less developmentally mature. And at that time, and that doesn't mean that everything we have to experience is oh, it's so mature. I'm just meaning there's a general gravity of what we appreciate. So perhaps it's one of the best mirrors for growing up in an interesting way, because if I try to think about something else readily available to show me in a mirror sort of way of my own development and where I'm at, where I've been, it's hard to find, except music and movies, pretty easy.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. If you go through sort of all the previous incarnations of your tastes, right? It's almost like an archaeology of self. You know what I mean? Like I can get a sense of what my patterns and shapes of mind were based on the kinds of art that I was attracted to. And then I can take that next step and be like, okay, so there's that inertia behind me. How is that presenting itself today? I think this is also why for a lot of the art we really deeply love and creates a lot of value in our lives, this is why we're able to continue growing into that art as we continue to mature, right? Because there's actually what's maturing here is our zone 2 sort of these factors that are under the hood of our consciousness, right?
Yeah. I was just thinking that funny experience, which I don't have hardly anymore, but if you meet somebody from your past long time ago, maybe someone from high school or something like that kind of thing, and if they are still just exactly into the exact same stuff they were at that time and you were, and then it's kind of weird. It's kind of nothing new, just literally the same movies and same music and art. Well, wow, we can feel that disconnect, and it's not to say that hey, there's plenty of things you throw on Ace Ventura, guess what? I'm still going to really enjoy it. It's a stupid ass movie, but if that was like only the extent of my maturity, then you'd be a little worrisome, right?
Right. Yep, that's true. All right, well, that's basically zone 1 and 2. If there's anything else we want to say about this, I mean, again, this is oftentimes sort of the cornerstone and the capstone of our artistic experience, because so much of this occurs within, obviously, our direct and immediate consciousness. And I think once we have a good sense of that, we can move on to the lower left quadrant.
One thing I would just throw in, not to take us on too much of an aside, but there's something about states impacting what you're experiencing in zone 1 and 2 also. And that shifting the states will actually change what's showing up and how you feel about what's showing up.
Right.
And one thing I'm bringing that up for is from a meditation experience. Since I'm here with a Buddhist geek, I'd like to bring it in. But I was on a intensive retreat in Malaysia on Penang Island, a Vipassana retreat there. And I remember the teacher mentioned the farther that you proceed in this path, the less you're going to care about music. It's going to just come across your screen of consciousness as unrelated, disjointed sounds that are just vanishing, and that the thread of music will fall apart for you. And that's why we don't even focus on music here. That was one of the things that moved me to a different path after that conversation with him. Right. But I did find later that after actually deepening in certain state experiences, some kinds of music, for whatever reason, they did fail to land subjectively for me anymore, where before they would. And now it just sounded like very cardboard going through the motion gestures that are you could see, emotion is supposed to be evoked here, and nothing happening.
Yeah, totally. That's a good point. Yeah, because so much, for at least, being generalizing here, there's a big arc of the path that is deconstruction. It's deconstructing and loosening the grip on experience, and then later having it reintegrate and reemerge. But it's so hard to assess all of this out because it's all happening at once. So like the state experiences, awakening can like totally change how we feel energetically about a piece of music. Like we feel the deeper energy of it, the deeper state experiences about it, and it just doesn't land for us, and yeah, it is really interesting that taking apart and putting back together again, and what still shows up and what just disappears. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, well, hopefully that was useful for people in terms of just differentiating, discerning the aspects of our individual consciousness that are fully available to us right now versus those aspects that just aren't, that we know aren't, that are just part of our unconscious, and they're always kind of ticking along in the background, right, giving shape to our phenomenological experiences in the moment. So hopefully that's helpful for people. And now we can make a transition to the lower left quadrant. And I think that this is another sort of this is another area where it's probably a little bit easy for people to intuitively grasp the difference between the inner of the lower left and the outer of the lower left. And one of the examples that I commonly use to help sort of foreground the difference here is, have you ever walked in on someone else's inside joke? Right? So you're hanging out with a bunch of friends, your friends tell an inside joke, you feel like an outsider. You know that they have a shared context here that you are outside of. You cannot take a first person view of their context because you're not a part of it. You can only look at it from the outside. So we feel this, and obviously these kind of exist in, concentric circles. I mean, you can be on the inside of, sort of one lower left circle and the outside of many, many others. Or you can share an inside, like, for example, all of us here today, we all speak English, right? So we all have a basic sort of lower left bubble that we sit in that we can share. And yet, Ryan, I have a different relationship with you than I have with Bruce. And if I start telling certain kinds of jokes, Ryan, that you and I have shared over the years, that's going to land one way. And same if I joke around with you, Bruce. going to land in another, and our audience is not going to be able to follow any of that. So, actually sort of minding our zone 3 and 4 containers, I think gets really important. And this is where a lot of, things like skillful means and knowing how to play to your audience, for example, this is where a lot of this comes in. So let me just describe real briefly the simplest distinctions between zone 3 and zone 4, and then we can unpack this a little bit. So zone 3 is the inside of the lower left, the inner of the lower left, which means the shared meaning and the experience that you have with other people. In this case, around a particular artwork, as well as with the artist, him or herself. So a question that you would ask here in zone 3 is, how are other people experiencing and interpreting this artwork? How do their experiences and interpretations influence my own? How would I respond to this artwork if the artist was standing right in front of me right now? Zone 4, on the other hand, is the outer of the lower left. This is how we sort of are able to appreciate how this piece of art fits into, larger cultural contexts or simply different cultural contexts. We might ask, we might consider how a given piece of art impacts, all of the sort of unspoken rules and permissions and taboos that shape our discourse. So when we have these kinds of conversations, there's an inner and an outer to it. And the inner is basically consists of everything that we actually share and relate with each other. And the outer is sort of like, again, this unspoken set of rules and permissions where if you transgress that, you're going to get some fairly immediate feedback. And in fact, stand-up comics, I think, make their home in zone 4. They make their home in trying to figure out exactly where those lines are drawn and trying to figure out if we can push that line in one way or the other. And sometimes they push too far and, their career suffers as a result. And other times the really masterful comics in our culture are able to at least bring these sorts of lines and taboos, etc., into consciousness, if not sort of subversively push them out a little bit more. So common zone 4 questions are going to be, what are the cultural currents or patterns that this artwork is trying to hold a mirror to? How resonant or subversive is this artwork? Is it playing it safe or is it pushing the edge? How would this artwork be enacted across multiple different cultures and contexts? So if I took this artwork out of our English-speaking American context and dropped it into, I don't know, Pakistani culture, how would it play? That requires a zone 4 perspective, right? In order to get a sense of that. Bruce, does this math check out?
Makes sense to me. Yeah, I think you put it well. And it was just putting me in mind of, if you've ever taken a journey through, different world music traditions and tried to expose yourself to very different types of music, for instance, you can really be confronted with that inside-outside joke, the inside-outside meaningful resonance thing. And for instance, I can think of, some forms of Korean music that I've listened to, or Japanese or Indonesian or other kinds of music, where when you listen to it, there can be a zone 1 response, an emotional response arising. But there's also like an aura of puzzlement around what are they trying to recreate here? What is the meaning that they're wanting to share? Because sometimes it really shows up as very alien. There's some Korean styles of music that when I was first exposed to them, it sounded like they were taking a long surf on very depressive currents, really deeply depressive mood that they were drawing out with their sounds. But it was totally puzzling. How am I supposed to relate to this? I couldn't get the inside cultural bead on what they were weaving.
And you can only do that by familiarizing, by basically learning the language, right? Learning the shared language, whatever that language happens to be, that is being used to enact this art within a particular culture. Ryan, I'm sure you've got some thoughts about this as sort of the language expert that you are. You've got a deep passion for language itself, and I'm sure that you have felt this sort of the line in the sand that separates Zone 4 as people are becoming more fluent.
Well, yeah, and the biggest thing where this shows up is humor. So, and for me, humor, comedy is one of the art forms. And yeah, so one of my teachers, my favorite version of Spanish is Mexican Spanish. It's just, to me, there's just the slang of Mexico is brilliant. But we'll, with one of my teachers, we'll share different humorous things from both the cultures, and some things that are really funny in Spanish you can't really translate in English, and vice versa. Like Key and Peele, is just one of the. Oh, actually, no. I talked with them about our clip on Team America.
Yeah.
That we shared in that episode. And just because the words have double meanings that work for us, like asshole means a part of the body, but it means like a person who's mean, not cool, or whatever, whatever we might say with that.
In that context, it meant red, amber, altitude.
Yeah. And it meant something even more meanings, right? But they don't have that same word in Spanish doesn't mean those multiple things. So you can see that like really quickly humor breaks down, and it can be one of the hardest things to get. That's like the last thing you get in learning a language, because you have to really immerse yourself in that zone 3. Really, it's a zone 3, and you're trying to find it through like zone 4, and I don't know where you put grammar and things like this, but it's really really interesting. And I was going to say also with the differentiation between zone 3 and zone 4, well, even with zone 4 in particular, so in one version of art, to me, it's validating, and you said resonating. So that's one thing. And I think of the Enneagram, for example, which is not art, but it's often a crowd pleaser. If somebody comes to it, they're just like, oh yeah, tell me about myself. And you're objectifying yourself in a certain sense. You remember the first time I came across Enneagram 4, and that's what I am. And I was like, oh yeah, it's validating. So art can be like that, where it's validating, even though we're seeing the outer of what was only inner, before that moment. And but then as soon as we make something outer, inevitably we're distancing ourselves from that, because we're no longer completely identified with these unspoken structures of culture and shared meaning. And then, it can be disturbing or disruptive, because we're something is shaken loose. And I think that's what the art that gets most attention in the kind of zone 4 area is, like, what is shaking shit up. And that's often what's happening. But the validating thing, I think, is totally happening all the time. We just don't talk about it very much because it's just, pleasant and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting here too, is that, like, if you look at this, so like if you have disruptive art, like, I don't know, some forms of graffiti or something like that, or just a new art form that's just like, we're going to do something totally different. It's going to make everybody uncomfortable. For that artist and the people who really, really appreciate that, that's actually not disruptive to them. That's their shared meaning, is like, this is the art we create. And so it's not disruptive for them. It's disruptive for other people who aren't in that shared developmental level or whatever it might be. So it's interesting how these things just keep cycling, in terms of alternating between what is subject as a we and what is object.
Yeah, Ryan, that's, I think, a critical point here, is that, again, these are not boxes on a piece of paper. These are not sort of discrete categories. In other words, all of these zones sort of have a way of bleeding into each other and creating feedback loops with each other. They dance. All of these zones are constantly dancing with each other. Yeah. And it's one thing to kind of press the pause button on reality, right? And say, okay, well, this is all clearly zone 3 phenomena. This is zone 4. Here's, and really kind of separate and tease things apart. But once you hit that play button again, and the universe is in motion again, and all of these things start to, again, bleed into each other. And create these resonances and disruptions and feedback loops and so forth.
Yeah. That's why, like, in my intro to integral theory that I gave a talk on at Buddhist Geeks, and that video is online. 30-minute talk is my best version of 30 minutes. I start off with a quote from Hokai Sobel, a tweet he had that, don't worry, it's just everything and everyone happening all at once. And that's always really important to never forget that. Like, it's really useful to distinguish this rather than making it a big blob of, without any distinctions. That's horrible. But, like, when we distinguish the stuff, then we got to, like, let that go and realize it's all happening at once. And that's really important. That's right. The last thing I want to say about this is, like, in terms of art, and we talked about this a bit, I think, in the one we did on movies. But this is in the lower left, zone 3 and 4, is where I often will feel the distinction between, especially in documentaries, where somebody wants, or no, it's even worse in fictional content, where somebody wants to talk at me. They want to get on a soapbox and tell me stuff rather than create a shared artistic experience, like immerse me in the shared meaning, the shared journey. And then at the end, I step back and say, wow, what happened? The experience changed me or solidified something. And you can always tell that, like, what happens there when somebody is trying to create this piece of art in a lower left kind of manner, but what they end up doing is not creating art and they're just talking at you, which doesn't feel good. And, you know, documentary, some people, it's kind of like Wilber says, go to imright.com, and like a documentary is like, yeah, tell me all the things I already know. And then that feels good. But for me, it's not great art.
Right. Right. Because the documentary is not trying to form a relationship with you.
Exactly.
You're
And
not
lower
part of
left
that
is a
music.
relational dimension. It's a relational dimension.
Right.
I have to go talk to the tree guys real quick.
Yeah,
I'll be
talk
right
to the
back.
three guys, and Bruce and I'll wrap a little bit.
Okay.
But, you know, another example of this where we can, I think, see all four of these zones that we've talked about so far kind of, you know, at play with each other is just in some of our favorite bands, musicians, artists that we've, you know, acquired throughout our lives. So, like, for example, one of my favorite hip hop bands ever is a band called Black Alicious. Unfortunately, the MC for Black Alicious, his name was Gift of Gab. He passed away just a couple weeks ago, which was deeply sad, and I was really shaken by his passing. Not only because he was super young, he was only 50 years old, and he just had 2 kidney transplants, and you know, we were all very excited for his recovery, and unfortunately, he ended up passing. But when I think about, you know, my love for this group, where does this love really come from? Well, it comes from, you know, I was in my 20s when I discovered Black Alicious. This was at a point when my spirituality, my spiritual self, my awakening path was really beginning to present itself to me in a very strong and powerful and insistent way. And yet I didn't have a lot of role models out there to emulate, right? I hadn't yet discovered, you know, I mean, I think I was into Ken, but that still felt like a very sort of small community that was supporting what he was doing. And I wasn't seeing much of this represented in the culture around me at all. And then I found this group where, you know, not only did they make me in my zone 1, I felt these states, right? I was like, oh, I'm able to recontact these states for myself just by listening to your music, which, oh, by the way, I'm tremendously attracted to because you're making music that's appealing to my, you know, these zone 2 factors that I have, right? But then there was that next step. It was not only is there an artist that's actually giving voice to sort of these unseen parts of myself, but that artist is then in turn being selected for in culture. These guys are finding popularity, which means I'm not the only one who sees something in what they're doing. And that is validating. That, I think, gets to Ryan's point. This is validating. Like, oh my God, I'm not going crazy. Other people experience this. And what was useful for me, Bruce, was that it wasn't just someone like me having similar set of experiences, but here's someone from a completely different cultural background, right? This is you know, someone who's 10 years older than me, African American, grew up on the West Coast. I grew up on the East Coast. So, you know, a different set of cultural experiences. And yet these same, what felt to me like universals, were being expressed through that different context. So in a way, sort of that shared and differing lower left context between zone 3 and zone 4 helped allow the art to resonate more deeply with me, to the point where, you know, 25 years later, they continue to be one of my all-time favorite artists.
That's
and
a
it's
great
purely
example.
from that resonance.
Exactly. Yeah, I was thinking about, do you ever watch, I think you do, I think we both kind of confess to each other that we have the secret vice of watching reaction videos sometimes.
Yeah.
Definitely I do.
Yeah.
But, you know, of course, in the music community, you know, often like with Dimash Kudaibergen, you know, all of his followers are the Deers, you know, or Lady Gaga, you know, has them, you know, they form a tribe, you know, they form this cultural movement and a tribe. And I was thinking about prospectively, what's interesting about what's going on with reaction videos. There's kind of between what's going on among most of the audience members maybe, and what's going on with the reactors. But on the one hand, we're vicariously enjoying their enjoyment or their reaction to that. But I think it's, you know, there's they refer to the reaction channel membership as family. There's definitely a sense of kinship that we're all enjoying taking this musical journey together. But they're entering the first person experience of encountering that music for the first time. And for many in the audience, I think it's almost a zone 2 thing, in that it's showing us our me of what I was like and what I felt when I first encountered that thing, encountered
Totally.
that piece of music.
Yep. No, that's a great example. And just so our audience knows exactly what we're talking about. So we're talking about those videos where you have like two hip hop guys listening to Megadeth, or there's other versions where you have two like metalheads listening to like
K-pop.
Jay-Z, right? Yeah, exactly. And describing their reactions. And it is really interesting because Bruce, I think that actually shows how we can simultaneously share these zone 3 containers at one sort of concentric level and also be sitting outside of them at another level, because where there's a shared sort of reality is, God, we all love music, right? Someone comes into this with a good faith kind of posture where like, I'm going to expose myself to new music because I love music, and I'm sure there's going to be something in these new experiences that I love. However, I'm going to be listening to things that are sort of outside of my idiom, right? And that idiom, your idiom, is defined in zone 3. Well, I mean, I'm going to take that back. That your idiom, I mean, there's unconscious elements to your idiom as well that are sort of being reinforced in zone 4. So just to make this, maybe a political example is actually going to help people a little bit with this. I often think about it in terms of the zone 3 is whatever happens to be discussed among a group of people at any given point in time, right? Those conversations can span any number of topics and territories and so forth. And yet, surrounding that conversation is something we might call an Overton window. This is something we hear about a lot in politics. Donald Trump comes along and he swings the Overton window. What does that mean? That means he's actually changing our zone 4 structures, changing the permission sets, the unspoken permission sets that we share, so that something that was taboo to talk about yesterday is no longer taboo to talk about today. And this reshapes, again, because these things bleed into each other. That then, changes how I relate in the upper left quadrant, both in terms of my direct zone 1 experience and my zone 2 sort of structures. It all gets kind of bent whenever one of these factors in any one of these zones changes. So does everything else, because this is always tetra emerging or octa emerging, whatever metaphor we want to use here. But I think the political example helps a little bit, because there's a lot of these terms that get thrown around a lot. And if we just take a closer look at it, we can actually see how this is actually delineating these 8 primary perspectives for us, which again just gives that much more proof to the idea that we're already always taking these perspectives. We just don't necessarily know it when we are.
Right.
And I think that becomes huge in the next quadrant. So should we shift to the upper right quadrant?
Yeah, let's go.
This is one where I struggled a little bit, Bruce, and I was very grateful for the time that we spent together sort of hashing this out. It's not that I had a hard time taking the perspective. I had a hard time communicating sort of the simplicity of this perspective. And that's the zone 5 perspective. So let me talk about the difference first, and then we can unpack this a little bit, because I think this is actually a really, really profound one. So the upper right quadrant, this is when we're looking at something from the outside, an individual object or holon or what have you from the outside. So we're looking at a person, a frog, or a set of signifiers such as an artwork, right? We're looking at it sort of objectively. So here we have 2 zones. The inner of the upper right is called zone 5. And basically what this is, let's continue talking about looking at a piece of art. If we're looking at a piece of art, the zone 5 question is basically going to be a reconstruction of the artist's interiors based on whatever it is that we happen to be looking at, right? So here's this artwork. Here are the forms of the artwork. Here is sort of the colors that they use or the sounds that they put together, the tonalities, all this stuff that we can look at in third person. What does this mean? As soon as we ask the question, what does this mean? We're taking a zone 5 perspective, right? Especially if we're basing that question purely on what we see, how the art is presenting itself to me right now. Well, what does that mean? Well, we have to reconstruct someone's interiors. This is, oftentimes when you think of the upper right quadrant, we think of it in terms of zone 6, just a third person, completely objective view. Let's just describe sort of how it works, how it behaves, etc. And that's sort of as objective as we possibly can get. That's a zone 6 perspective. So that would be viewing the artwork as a self-contained whole, appreciating its objective forms and features, as well as the skills, talents, techniques, and performance from the artist that was required in order to produce it in the first place. But this is all, we're not asking questions like, what does it mean? We're not bringing any first person sort of awareness to that. We're just looking at it objectively. But the minute we start asking the question, what does this artwork actually mean based on the forms that I see in front of me right now? Now we're taking a zone 5 perspective. And zone 5 is profound for reasons we'll talk about in a minute, because it's a perspective we are always taking without knowing it. And that's why it was so hard for me to figure out how to communicate it.
Exactly. Yeah. When we were first talking about it also, I was thinking about it in its more advanced forms and thinking that this comes on pretty late. But the more that we went through it and tried to simplify it, the more apparent it became that this is actually something that begins to surface in us even, very early, even as soon as we're able to take a theory of other minds.
Right.
Yeah, there's another way of framing the zone 5 that I talked to you about, which I think is more tentative, but I think it's hard to make a whole discipline out of it. But for me, if zone 5 is defined as basically the inside of an exterior, and we arrive at the inside through a process of reconstruction based on our observations of exterior elements. And a good example of this is something like von Wexkull's biosemiotics, where he will look at different organisms and then attempt to reconstruct their experiential world based on their ecological niche and their equipment, and whatever we know about the organism and their environment and what is important to them. We can begin to reconstruct what is the experiential world of that being. And of course we can do it, as we talked about, with other people too, looking at them from the outside and trying to imagine what's the world like for them based on what I can see from the outside. So that relates to what you're saying about trying to get at what the artist's interior was like in the creation of that piece of work. But there's also something I wanted to highlight, which is that sometimes the work itself seems to have a kind of interiority. It doesn't have a conscious agency like it's, a living, fully developed sentient being, but there's a aura to it that I think I used the word with you, a kind of mana that comes out of it.
I think you said mana funk.
Yeah, funk. Yeah,
Which
there's a funk to it, mana funk to it. There's some quality of presence that manifests from the artwork that sometimes you can't even directly trace, at least consciously, to the artist's intent.
Right.
It may not, it happens in the magic of the proportions and the interplay of the elements, that there is some kind of power that comes through it that you can subjectively feel. That's not your feeling. It's a communication. You have subjective states in reaction to an object, but also you can sense sometimes an emanation from a piece of music or from an object that seems to be its own, powerful, scintillating presence.
Yeah. And maybe this is associated with subtle energies, which again can get a little bit tricky to talk about. Maybe it's just a matter of proportions, like you're saying. I mean, there's sometimes you look at a landscape and it has that mana funk to it. Now, there was no artist, there was no agent that created, a sunset as an artifact, for example. This is sort of just a naturally, organically occurring process. And yet even there can be a radiance. It feels almost like a communication, but there's not necessarily an agent behind it. There's just a transmission. And it can be hard to put your finger on what that feels like, looks like, tastes like, other than, there's just sort of a funk, a glow, a spark, a certain allure, maybe a life force, but in a different way than we usually mean that in sort of, when it comes to biology and such. And it's mysterious, and it's as you say, it's hard to talk about because you can't quite put it into a bottle. Right? But the other aspects of Zone 5, this is where we, I think, really can. And I love that you mentioned biosemiotics, because just to show that this is stuff that comes online fairly early in our development, or at least it can come online fairly early in our development. Just last week, I was having a conversation with my daughter, who's 8 years old, and we were basically asking, what is it like to be this animal versus that animal? What would it be like to be a dog, right? And I would frame it like this. So we know that, these animals all sense reality differently. They have different sensory organs, right? So a dog is primarily reconstructing its reality based on scent, right? And a bat is mostly, reconstructing its reality based on sound. And people, we sort of rely on visuals, right? That's how when we close our eyes, we see a visual world. So what is it to be a dog? What is it to be a bat? And she would close her eyes and she would step into these perspectives and she would try to describe sort of, what that feels like. That was an 8-year-old girl taking a Zone 5 perspective, which is profound. And again, it shows that we're doing this all the time. In fact, we do this every day on the internet. Right? Whenever we're interacting with people who we don't know, we have no shared relationship with these people. It's just a name on a screen and a string of words. And then we start trying to ascribe an interior to those words. What kind of person would say something like that? What we're doing is we're reconstructing each other in Zone 5 based only on these third-person signifiers that we have. So whenever an integralist says something really stupid like "you're so green," in order to write off someone's entire, point of view, they are taking an irresponsible Zone 5 perspective. And what they're not doing is recognizing that this is limited to Zone 5, because you don't know, again, you have no relationship with these people. And rather than trying to form a relationship, rather trying to develop a shared context that would actually give you that much more, traction in your assessment of each other, instead you just kind of jump right to labeling each other. Oh, you're so paranoid, you're so green, you're not into, whatever it might be. That is a Zone 5 sort of reconstruction of someone's interiors based on very, very limited sort of objective data that we have. And again, it's something we're doing all the time.
Exactly. It's very common to hear on the internet people complaining about, oh, you're just projecting on me, as if projecting on somebody was a wrong thing to be doing. But I think now we really understand that projecting is something that we're always doing. It's right. It's part of our Zone 5 activity. It's part of the overall suite of things that we do to build relationships with others. So there's always this element of reconstructing and projecting. It's just we can do it better or worse.
That's right.
And
yeah, Ryan, it reminds me of several episodes ago, we were talking about, I can't remember the episode name, but it was Inhabit Your Social Media or something like that. Yeah. But we were basically talking about internet hygiene. Yeah. Right. That was sort of the basis of the show, is internet hygiene. And so much of this hygiene, well, we can see how it gets kind of farmed out across all of these different perspectives. There's a Zone 4 hygiene, there's a Zone 2 hygiene, but there's also this Zone 5 hygiene where we need to be able to call ourselves out, right, and prevent ourselves from kind of sliding into what Bruce was talking about, sort of this pure projection. Because actually, oftentimes what we're doing is we're partially taking a Zone 5 perspective, but we're loading it up with our own Zone 2 baggage, right? Which again shows how these perspectives kind of bleed on each other and why we need a little bit more fluency with these perspectives in order to tell, one apart from the other.
Yeah. It's interesting based on the context, so I wrote down some notes here for this upper right. In the context integral community, those are the kinds of things I would say, Corey, like what you just said, because tends to be objectively. I'm saying this is what tends to be the behavioral pattern. So I'm making an objective statement here, like an upper right kind of statement about what I see, and in an inference about what I think it means about people's interiors, which I'm okay with. In a pluralistic context, there's maybe some allergy to that, where it's like you can't say something objectively because all of that exists in cultural context, and things like that. But, it's kind of one of those things like, well, the old saying, like, if it quacks like a duck, well, that's can be a cop out. Like, it's just like, I can just validate myself and being like, I'm right because I just said it quacks like a duck, and that's very simple. So there you go. But no, but it's kind of like that. Like, literally, if you hear something quacking and you see it flip flopping around, we can recognize patterns in reality as objective things and make an estimated guess that, like, that thing that I see floating across the water, I think that's a duck. Yeah, but in the end, maybe I'm wrong. But like Bruce, what you said, we can do all this better or worse. So I think we're right now looking at upper right. So let's just lean into it. You know what I mean? So that's where it's upper right, and upper right is all about it. So what are we itting here? So for me, like, just a couple of things, like, in simple terms of like art, we look at film and we can talk about the color palette, right? Mm-hmm. This is something really simple, like looking at color tones. And some directors, for example, are well known for color palette, like Wes Anderson, like, automatically, look at that. That's really interesting. Automatically, without just seeing the color palette and the presentation of the screen, a person could be like, it's gotta be Wes Anderson. Now, it could be wrong, but a lot of times you can be really right. And then if you add in other things, the tonality of the delivery of the actors, like, you can map that out on frequency. Like, is it more of an understated, there are a lot of understated monotone sort of ballparkish, things, combined with the color palette, combined with the type of music, you combine all these different its, you can make an assumption about who that person was, including their interior. So these things we happen all the time. And of course, the bigger question then we say, what does that evoke, in us? And that is really interesting because obviously, like, well, can we say the color yellow objectively evokes something in a human being? That's harder. Sounds like music or just different kinds of sounds, maybe we can say something like that. So if, like, you scrape your nails on a chalkboard, yeah, maybe someone's out there is like, that's so good. I love that. Keep doing that. That could very well be the case. But you could do a test and say, like, how many people have a visceral response that they subjectively report? We can map out their brain and say, like, what activity do we see happening? Do we see a fight or flight response, when nails are across the chalkboard? And so we can make some inferences, about objectively, like, well, this thing produces this kind of thing, response in the audience. And of course, all of that goes into, like, the thing about, like, what does this mean? But at first we have to look at those initial layers and say, like, for me, those are very valid.
I couldn't hear.
Watch, this it is talking to me. Yeah, so we get at the meaning, but, like, that's a very valid path to say, like, and that's where I think filmmakers, for example, really dive into. That's what it's all about. Like, how can I use these its to hopefully produce some range of responses in those people who are watching it, and therefore, like, the reverse engineering, like, Bruce, you were kind of talking about that, reconstructing. Yeah, we can do that and say, like, oh, well, all these colors, all these sounds. Like, I remember in Dark Knight, one of the its that I found fascinating was Hans Zimmer tried to find a sound to play in these repetitive scenes with the Joker, and he finally landed on a razor blade across strings, like, and it's really subtly under there, but, like, you hear it and it creates a tension because usually we don't like metal scraping sounds. Doesn't evoke a relaxed state of being, it's tense, Yep. So, and then the other thing, Bruce, you mentioned something here that I wrote down, like, that there's an interior to the art, like an it factor to it. So in the same way that we could take a psychedelic, that's an it thing, that's having an it response that then has some correlates that we can predict, like that happening in the brain. I think that happens in art and music. Now, with psychedelics, we can really identify that, the chemistry and all this stuff, and then say, well, this is what's likely to happen, where it's a little bit harder in art. But I think that's true too. There's an it aspect to it that, like, in and of itself, because of all these different factors and how it impacts us, we can see a reflection in our own biochemistry. That's just it's super obvious that it happens. It's not as so obvious to, like, how we describe those its. And because of that, last thing I'll say here is transmission. So we talk, you were using different words, Bruce, but that's the same for me. The same thing is, like, it transmits. And this is really interesting because we can talk about in Dharma, like receiving transmission from teacher to student, that's considered really important. Something happens there that's magical. But we can talk about that too. And I'm a believer in this too, that like if you see a teaching written down, it's now in an it form, it's in a book, it's ink on a piece of paper, and there's words there, but it transmits. I've had that experience, like something happened there, that I'm just not going to deconstruct and say nothing is meaningful happening there. So anyways, all this stuff comes up for me in this upper right it zone.
Yeah, that's all really well said, Ryan. And it got me thinking about things like music theory and color theory, which I think are largely sitting on that line between zone 6 and zone 5. Because what it's saying is we expect that the average person, these tones are going to produce these, interior effects, right? We associate these with these. Now, that's not necessarily going to be true from individual to individual in terms of their actual zone 1 experience. But we predict that yellow on average is going to make people feel happy, red's going to make people feel agitated, and and light blue is going to make people feel calm. So there's
the cultural context.
This is sort of zone 5 work.
Yeah, it's really an example of like an it thing of cultural context. So one thing, if you ask the average person in the United States, do people in Latin America, South America like spicy food? I guarantee you most people would say, yeah. But actually, Mexico is really a place where they really like things spicy. So a food that has a spicy effect produces a joyful response, like a subjective response. But actually, in like Venezuela or Colombia, no, they're like, oh no, they eat actually much more mild. So there's some assumptions there that like, oh, if I make a spicy food, it will produce certain subjective responses, and that might not be the case. So there's some cultural stuff there for sure, and that's like in the pluralist context, there is truth to that because we have a lower left quadrant. So it's a little harder to nail down, but like at the same time, I wouldn't toss it all out to say that no, even that cultural context, then we could objectively identify like these factors of it can produce this particular result in this group of people.
Yeah. Yep. And Bruce, when we were talking, you mentioned something really interesting, which was you reminded me that Ken Wilber had once described the integral project itself as largely a zone 5 project. Why don't you tell us a little bit what you think he meant by that?
He didn't say it directly, actually, but it was in the afterword to the Dancing with Sophia book. And it was also a part of a presentation that he gave at I think it was the 2013 Integral Theory Conference. But in there, he was talking about all of the zones and talking about critical realism and how it tends to focus on some more than others, and that you need to be able to take all. And then he talked about what integral involves in terms of all of the zones. But then when he actually described why it's important to take all the zones, he actually described it in terms of enactment and autopoetic play. So he actually used the language of zone 5 to basically describe the integral project. And I think I used the phrase with you that that the zone 5 is kind of like the Klein bottle contact point in the aqua matrix, in that there's a kind of everything kind of loops back into zone 5, where there's this notion of autopoiesis and enactment, but there's this, I think, this kind of deep intuition that we can see the soul of the cosmos, in a sense, that we relate to the whole cosmos as having an interior and an exterior, and that's an avenue into feelingly contacting the whole display and bringing it together in integrative harmony. To me, there's a zone 5 element to working with the interior and the exterior that way, in order to bring together a more coherent, dynamically unfolding and active evolutionary picture of reality.
That's beautiful. It's a beautiful frame because, Ken often says this material is psychoactive. And I think what he means by that, I just was talking about this in another show, what he means by that is that integral theory really comes with a mirror, right? And if you're doing integral in purely third person terms, where again, you're just pushing diagrams around on a piece of paper, you're just drawing boxes and lines and, sort of, it's a categorical approach to integral. It's not an enactive approach to integral. And I think that is sort of that's the zone five-ness of it, that you can't talk about these ideas without simultaneously inhabiting these ideas and sort of, reflecting that mirror within. And in fact, if you're not doing that, you're probably missing something really, really important here. And I think it's a really good point. And I also see this, Bruce, something we talked about before the show. I also see this in terms of like, so much of our legal system is built in zone 5, right? Because what our legal system is asking a jury to do is to look at the third person facts of a case and determine whether or not the defendant intentionally, willfully transgressed, right? That's the difference between murder and manslaughter, for example. And that's a big distinction. Intent is a huge distinction when it comes to law. But you can't trust that the person you're talking to is going to be truthful about their intent. So you can only reconstruct their intent based on the third person facts and factors of the case. So the jury's presented these factors. They're given an argument to why that violates the laws in the lower right quadrant, and then they're left to determine for themselves whether this person intended to commit those crimes or not. And their punishment is going to be based largely on how much intent was in there. But figuring out that intent is purely a zone 5 activity, because we're saying right from the beginning, I can't trust that this person is going to be completely truthful in how they present themselves to me. Right. So I have to reverse engineer this from the facts that are presented to me from the lawyers, from the prosecution, et cetera.
That's a great point. And when you were talking with me about that this morning, you gave a caveat that there's also the lower left involved in that, the intersubjective testimony. So it really seems that we're weighing both.
Yeah.
What we can construct of the interior based on the external factors that are available to us, and the testimony of reliable, witnesses and other parties.
That's
and
right.
Together, that can help us really get hopefully a good sense of what the intent was.
Yeah, I think if the lawyer is worth their money, they're doing everything they can to make sure that the jury doesn't only have third person facts to consider the case. They're going to do their best to bring in some of these second person lower left elements. They're going to bring in character witnesses, either for or against, right? I mean, either side can bring in character witnesses, again, just to help the jury form a relationship with the defendant, rather than only judging them based on the third person sort of facts of the case. Because sometimes the facts of the case just are misaligned, right? They suggest something, but don't necessarily prove intent. I mean, someone really could have been in the wrong place at the wrong time and have a clusterfuck of circumstance that makes them look guilty. But as soon as you bring in some of these second person, lower left kind of character reinforcing perspectives, that calculus changes a little bit, and therefore our sense of how guilty they are or how innocent they are can change. And I think this is the same thing when we're talking about how we are constantly engaging in zone 5 perspectives when we're talking on the internet with each other. If someone is completely anonymous, then you're really only limited to a zone 5 point of view. But Bruce, when you and I talk online, on Facebook or whatever, we have a whole history of relating behind us, right? So we're not only seeing each other in third person, we're also seeing each other in second person, and therefore we can have a more authentic reconstruction of each other as we go. That doesn't only exist within sort of that confinement of zone 5. We can have a more authentic enactment. I get a better sense of who you are as a person because we have a shared history together.
Right.
And that should be the goal of anyone. So if you're watching this, next time you accuse someone of being so green because you disagree with the signifiers you see in a chat window on your screen, maybe just take an opportunity to try to deepen that relationship a little bit and understand that there's a lot of iceberg underneath the surface that you have no awareness of whatsoever. And I think that this helps us be a little bit more kind right? And maybe a little bit more patient with each other as we interact with each other on places like Facebook.
Yeah, thankfully, my picture of you is not built only by the authors of Integral 2.0.
Thank God for that. That's an inside joke. So some of our audience are feeling their zone 4-ness right now.
Mm-hmm.
But that's okay. We'll just leave it there. So let's move this into the lower right quadrant. And this is, I think, another fascinating territory that has some really important political implications, I think, that we can unpack in a second. And in a way, this can be a little bit, again, these right-hand quadrants, these right-hand zones can be a little bit tricky at first. But I think if we sit with them long enough, then it kind of sinks in and it clicks, right? And once it clicks, you start seeing it everywhere. So the main distinctions in the lower right quadrant is between zone 7, the inner of the lower right, and zone 8, which is the outer of the lower right. So zone 7, if you're looking at a piece of art and you want to take a zone 7 perspective, some of the things you might consider would be what social and systemic factors shape the artwork's creation and meaning, as well as my own experience of the artwork. So a question here is, what are the conscious or unconscious social conditions and circumstances surrounding the artist that are embedded in this artwork? How does that inform the artwork itself? How does it change the meaning of the artwork itself? How do my own social circumstances influence my experience and my enactment of this artwork? So I just want to say, this is sort of the zone where we see a lot of the wokeism movement, for example, or the critical race theory movement. They are very, very keen on sort of these zone 7 inertias, right? And how our perspectives can be unconsciously conditioned by the surrounding systems and circumstances that we find ourselves in, and how that conditioning can itself shape or change or transform the meaning of a particular work of art with or without the artist intending that to be so, right? So this is sort of a place where a healthy Marxist point of view can start to come in. Like, let's track what these sort of conditions are and then try to estimate how this shows up within an average consciousness that's actually engaging this system, right? So what are the embedded unconscious elements? Like, this is where we can talk about, this artwork was made from privilege, or was made, you know what I mean? There's any number of these terms that we can start to use that actually become a little bit more useful if we locate them in this zone, and much less useful when they sort of color outside of the lines and get misapplied to other zones. Just to finish the cycle before we unpack it a little bit, zone 8. So that was zone 7. Zone 8 is pointing to these social conditions themselves sort of objectively. So when we're looking at art, we might appreciate the overall technical, economic, and logistical systems and collaborations that made the artwork possible, including the overall quality of production, distribution, and or commercial value of the artwork. How well did this artwork sell? That is actually going to factor into your appreciation of a piece of art. How mainstream was this, or how underground was this, or so forth. A question that you might ask is, what kinds of tools, instruments, or technologies made this artwork possible? How successful was the artwork? What kind of behind the scenes collaborations made it possible? How does the overall production quality enhance or detract from the transmission of meaning? And for me, I engage this practice all the time. When I watch something that I really like, I go to IMDb, right? And I start looking at every actor that was in it. I want to know where they were in their careers when they created this thing. I want to know what was going on with the director. I want to know, what's going on in the writer's life. There's just something I want to understand, sort of the lower rightness of how this production, this collaboration came together in the first place. And that actually sort of factors into my appreciation of a work of art.
Yeah. One of the obvious things, I mean, I've got several notes here, but one of the obvious ones to look at in art is sales. Just simple. Everybody's experienced this. Like, is an artist, quote, selling out, which means that creating art mainly for a benefit of a social economic system or under pressure. You know, the record label, for example, says you need to make a song that sells. It needs to go like this, sound like this. Now go perform it. You know, and it's like, okay, they do that. Or, you know, you find, I saw the other day, I don't know, some random video about Radiohead, their OK Computer album. Like the record label was just like, no effing way. This thing is crazy garbage, and they're like, tough, we're going to do it anyway. So they kind of pushed against that social economic system, and it ends up being one of the most popular albums of all time. But you can see that a lot, you know, and especially music. I think because music, we often say this should be pure, give me your music, right? And if it doesn't feel pure, we note that, or maybe we don't, because we're just like, I don't care, I give me the candy, you know. Film is a little bit harder sometimes, right? Because there's so much, you can't hardly make a film without all the economics being involved. And so sometimes it's hard to know, is somebody creating a film authentically or not. TV, we see this quite a lot, you know, like, does a series continue or not simply based on economics? That's it. It could be how many amazing shows in recent years have been canceled for no good reason, not because of the art, because art is great, but because of some hidden algorithm that we don't even have access to now, because only in Netflix or the app. And so this impacts greatly our experience of it. Some other simple things like, do we watch an episode one at a time, or do we get to binge it?
Right.
That's a totally different experience. And that's a system, the technological systems, the control of the delivery systems. Does it have ads or not? That's changed big time. Like, I don't watch anything with ads anymore, you know, but that used to be part of our viewing experience. And that was very much part of a social economic system. But, you know, on the deeper things, like some of the, you know, if we look at cultural systemic oppression and racism, we look at like who has access to resources, and you can trace this back to like who has access to education, like who can get into the best music schools, who can get into film schools, such that you get the experience to develop your artistic abilities and then have contacts, so you can then get your script in front of somebody. It's already really incredibly hard to get a film made, you know, and that impacts what films get made and who gets spots in a movie. These are all social economic factors that aren't just, it's not just somebody's merit. Like, this is really clear in a heavily capitalist system that, yeah, not everybody's getting to make the art. And one last thing I'll throw out there as something really interesting that I think ties into this is like country music is really, really interesting. It's one of the ones you can analyze that show quite distinctly for quadrants in there. And I don't really listen to country music, but I do like Sturgill Simpson. It was the first country music artist that I heard that I was like, I want to get this album. He's really progressive, also seems to be kind of deep spiritually. Won a Grammy for best country album, but this country music CMAs, they won't even let him in the door.
Oh, wow.
Now maybe that's a bit, yeah, so it might be a bit more on the there's things happening. It's heavily on that lower left side of like, that doesn't, but right. That's, think about that. But then there's the systems of controlling who he has access to, right? So he can't get access on television to be performing in front of all this massive audience because they don't like his lower left stuff or some of the whatever bizarre state experiences, things that he communicates. But it's really fascinating to see how this play out. But those are the kind of things that, of course, too, Corey, I love behind the scenes and like, how does a film get made, especially because it's so crazy that we can even make a film, and how many systems it takes to all work so that way we can just sit back and watch a film and then criticize it.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. And I think oftentimes the postmodern move is to recognize that the sort of the medium is just as much a part of the art's transmission as anything else. It's not just a canvas. It's not just, but like, no, this is actually, so I think, for example, you know, the Beatles, one of the things that the Beatles did was they weren't just playing their instruments, you know, according to their skills in the upper right quadrant. They took the entire studio and turned it into an instrument. They made an instrument out of their shared environment. And that was a postmodern move. That was actually them saying, this isn't, you know, the studio isn't just the background where it's capturing our performance. It's actually part of the performance. Right. And they innovated this new way of making albums that was totally that abandoned this idea that the studio was only there to get the highest fidelity live-ish recording you can. It was actually like, no, there are tons of possibilities in the studio that we can't find outside the studio. Let's play with those possibilities and bring this into our art sort of explicitly. Right. Which in turn created the platform for things like electronic music, for example. Or like this, you know, the medium is the message, which is a very, very common postmodern refrain. And in fact, Bruce, I would love your opinion on this, because my sense is that of all these zones, zones 7 and zone 4 really begin to come online, particularly zone 7, at later altitudes. It's hard to discern zone 7. It's hard to discern how systems are actually limiting or affecting choices being made on by the individual participants of a system. It's hard to notice that until you get to the green altitude, or at least at the green altitude is when you really start caring a whole lot about it, which again, I think is my good faith enactment of wokeism. A lot of sort of the conditions that wokeism is responding to with a great amount of urgency can be found in zone 7 and can be found in zone 4. And oftentimes zone 7 and zone 4 have a way of sort of reinforcing each other, which in turn reinforces our zone 2 shadows and structures of consciousness, because these all bleed with each other. But is that your sense that a zone 7 perspective it comes a little bit later in the game?
Yes. Yeah. I think even zone 8 and 7, there are simpler ways that we can engage with systems and take systemic perspectives and be aware of interdependence and things like that. But often it's actually not until we have access to computer technology that allows us to detect patterns over time and interrelate factors together with, you know, once you get past 2 or 3 feedback loops, the human brain is overwhelmed in terms of being able to make any adequate kinds of predictions. And we only really can begin to build a systems picture using software that can help, you know, run different equations and scenarios and then give it to us in a presentable form that we can digest. We can kind of deceive ourselves that we're actually seeing systemically when actually we're really seeing often at best some down translated simpler pictures based on you know more complex analyses. So that's just one technological side to that. And you know, I think, you know, something like social autopoiesis, where it's looking at communication flows within a system. You know, you can track that, but it's without, you know, software and without a lot of research, it's really hard to do that. You know, I think memetics, you know, the growing art of memetics is trying to do that now, looking at how memes operate within systems. And there's a, you know, a zone, both left hand and right hand lower quadrants are involved in that. So yeah, but definitely I think it comes on later and it's hard to do well. And, you know, I think that's a real learning curve for all of us, is to be able to practice the art of systems thinking and really develop in that, learning to see and appreciate feedback loops and how they work and how they interact, and to recognize the limitations on our ability to actually do that well.
Right.
I wanted to throw in a couple little extraneous kinds of things just very quickly about what I could possibly be associated with the lower right and art. I'm thinking about some analyses again that were done with mathematics and computers, but beginning to perceive similarities mathematically in the patterning, for instance, of a culture's music and a culture's architecture. That there's a deep systemic ratio going on in terms of how people are interrelating, you know, different elements to create an aesthetic, to create a mood, to promote states that are often happening unconsciously, but are nevertheless detectable systemically in terms of, you know, what kind of, you know, intervals and scenarios and notes are used in a composition, and what are you know, the proportions used in architecture or in you know, fashion and other or ritual enactments. You know, those things are present systemically, but they're not easy to pick up on. But once you do, they're really fascinating to investigate. You know, in terms of what's going on. You know, with the overall cultural zeitgeist and the kinds of art that they're producing. And although this is a bit on the mythic side, I was thinking about uh, what some old Chinese emperors used to do, which is that they would listen for certain kinds of, they would have people go out to different parts of the kingdom and listen for what kinds of scales are being used. And there was a sense that certain scales are harmony producing and certain scales are disharmonic. And they wanted to try to catch where disharmony was growing in a cultural system and in a social system and stop it because they felt systemically that would have broad impact on the health of that community and the relationship of that community to the rest of the empire or the kingdom.
Very interesting. And that actually, so I just wanted, because there's a version of that in the West too, around the evolution of temperance, right? How do we tune a piano, right? Because pianos can't be tuned sort of linearly. There's a curvature to sound that can be really, really, you know, make it very, very difficult to tune a piano where every note is sort of harmonizing in key with all the other notes because of that curvature. So, you know, we've had imperfect temperaments throughout our history. So this is all zone 8 stuff. This is like how music theory is sort of, you know, organized so that we can use it to create art. However, the options, the opportunities that you have to create art are either going to be limited or opened up by sort of the lower right rule set that you're coming from. So for a long time with previous versions of temperance, there were some notes that actually became literally illegal to play. Laws were written to prevent musicians from playing certain notes because these notes were too discordant and disharmonious and associated with evil. It was the devil's notes, right? And then, you know, we sort of went through a couple other versions of temperance where you actually sort of mitigate that problem. There aren't these dead zones on the keyboard anymore like there used to be. But it's fascinating because we start here with sort of a set of rules in the lower right quadrant in zone 8, which is then going to, we can take the perspective of how those rules are going to limit creativity by taking a zone 7 look, or by looking at actual artifacts that were created under those rules and do a direct comparison. But every step of the way, we're seeing how these perspectives, once you change one factor here in this zone, all of a sudden you're changing culture a little bit, both on the inside and the outside. You're changing consciousness a little bit, both on the inside and the outside. And this is one of the reasons why I continue to think that an integral response to the social justice movement needs to include these kinds of perspectives. These are the valuable perspectives that are being surfaced by things like critical race theory that we want to, you know, avoid throwing out with the rest of the bathwater. And there's a lot of bathwater there too. But if integral doesn't actually consciously take on these perspectives and either transclude them or come up with a more fulfilling set of zone 7 and zone 4 factors themselves that have more explanatory power, then, you know, we're not actually having, I think, a healthy relationship with some of these cultural emergence that we're seeing. And in fact, I think that by recognizing these zones and how some of these theories really do excel in some of these zones, but completely fall on their face when they misapply them to other zones. Again, like, you can't take a Marxist look at sort of how consciousness can be shaped by our systems and then start calling people a racist because of it. That's a zone category error right there. Just because an average person is growing up in these systems doesn't mean that their zone 2 structures are determined to be bigoted or racist or homophobic or what have you. It just means that like, oh, this can happen to an average person. It doesn't mean it did happen to an average person. So this is where we have to be careful. And this is what I get really excited about, because I'm like, this is how Integral can begin to directly contribute to these conversations, clean them up by putting things in their proper place, right? Everything in its right place. And once we have a sense of like, okay, you're allowed to color here, but the minute you color outside the lines and go into another zone, you're doing bad non-exclusion. We can call you on that and you can rein it back in. That way there, we can actually take your work and it can be useful in sort of a larger enfoldment of all these different perspectival zones. That seems really urgent right now. Yeah.
And Corey, I've still been really liking how you referred to green as pre-integral in a lot of ways, and just kind of still turned around in my head over and over. And one of the things is that like it's so interesting that green as pre-integral has like so many things going for it all at once, and yet like can't get it all together in order to be effective. That's the thing, like to be really effective. And it's just because all the pieces haven't been put together enough. You know, certain things aren't owned. The authority especially is not really owned, even though it's acted out. And so integral can do that. Now, on the integral side, since we're speaking to presumably people who are at this kind of maturity level, the thing is that like we really have to inhabit. Like we've said this since day one. Like if you're not actually inhabiting everything you're talking about, then you're not like one. We might not be integral. That's one. I know, scary thought that like, oh, actually, just because we're reading Ken Wilber's books doesn't mean that that's where we're living from. But maybe we are. But like it's just not fully enough, and that means that we can't be effective as integral people. So like, and that's why I think art is actually really, really incredibly useful to viscerally evoke that, like, where am I inhabiting and where am I not inhabiting? So using for example, the model we created today, or that really you and Bruce mapped this out. I'm just here along for the ride. That like, if we can use this map, you know, and as a way to inhabit, then maybe we can get somewhere. But if not, man, it's just a tired old story, and we need change. We need effectiveness in the world. So I like this combination. Art feels fun and enjoyable, and integral theory feels incredibly useful. It gives us perspectives, but combine the two, man, maybe we get somewhere. Yeah. Maybe that's why these episodes have been popular, like when we covered the movies and things like that.
Yeah, that's right. No, that's right. Because there is, you know, again, our art oftentimes speaks for us, it speaks through us. And, you know, we have the luxury and really a privilege of being able to grow up alongside our art. I mean, there's a sense in which it feels like our art is maturing alongside us. It's really our enactment of art that's maturing with every step. But that is such a rewarding feeling, right? Where like you can be completely just swept away by a piece of art when you're, say, 18 years old, right? And then 20 years later, you are still swept away by that same piece of art. Like you get that same zone one phenomenology of just like, I lost myself to this. And yet that gets reinforced by all these other little details and perspectives that have come online ever since the first time you saw that artwork. So that artwork, it feels like it grew with you. You can see more of it, right? Even if the effect it has on you is more or less the same, there's more of it to have that effect. And that is, I mean, there's something just absolutely gorgeous about that, something very, very special about that, right? And I think that that's what, you know, I think that we tend to be more attracted to forms of art where we can have exactly that kind of relationship, where we have a sense that like, there's a little bit of this that's over my head right now, and I can't wait to catch up to it. Right? I can't wait to revisit this 10 years from now. I think those are the pieces of art that really get, you know, sort of tattooed onto our hearts in a certain kind of way.
Just commenting about the difficulty of apprehending systems, taking the systems view. There's a exception to that, and that is really that stories are like the inside of systems.
Oh, interesting.
And it's through story that we can begin to feel the contours and the dynamics and the interactions of systems. And so that to me brings art very centrally into the picture in terms of really understanding and working with and affecting change in our systems is telling the right stories with both the right depth and the right edges to them that raise that puzzlement and that can inspire that growth.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Yep. No, it's beautiful. Well, guys, it's been over an hour and a half here.
Yeah.
Do we have anything else we want to throw on the table before we start to? I'm thinking one of the things I'll do is I'll just read real briefly the questions from each zone, just as kind of put a capstone on it, and because there's a lot of complexity here, and I'm hoping that there's a simplicity on the other side of that complexity that can help people, again, just be a little bit more fluent with these perspectives and a little bit more confident of their capacity to enact them at any given moment. But before we do that, is there anything else that we want to throw on the table?
If there's a moment, I have a 4-question pop quiz. There are 4 major theories of art. Imitationalism, basically, how well does this represent that?
Mhm.
It's looking, how accurate of a representation of the object is this? What zone is that?
That feels largely like a zone 6 point of view. I mean, if we're doing an object to object comparison.
Yeah, for me too. It feels like zone 6. How about formalism, which basically just looks at all of the elements of the artwork and how well they're executed and how well they're interrelated?
Largely zone 6, but also maybe a bit of zone 8.
Right. Then emotionalism, basically, what are the feelings that it evokes? And art is successful for how well it evokes feelings.
That's going to be a zone 1 right there.
Yeah.
Right. And let's see. Oh, yeah. Instrumentalism, which basically means that the art, how successful is the art at communicating a message?
Oh.
There we go. Zone 3, baby.
Yep.
Yeah. With all the zone 4 constraints about what kinds of messages can or can't be delivered at a given time.
And you could even get some zone 7 in there too, in terms of affecting systemic change through.
Right. Cool. That's great.
Yeah. No, that was a nice little breakdown. And again, I think what it shows us is how valuable truly subversive art is. Which isn't to say that resonant art, sort of verifying art isn't. Ryan, when you were gone, I was telling Bruce about one of the reasons why I love Black Alicious so much is because they resonated with me. They weren't subverting anything within me. They sort of helped me feel like, oh, other people have these experiences too. But the art that we tend to really hone in on, right? The art that we 20 years later look back on and be like, wow, that was important art, right? Is going to be like that subverse, like this art was created in, among a certain set of circumstances and all that, but it itself changed the circumstances. It changed what we feel like we're allowed to talk about. It changed what we're allowed to find beautiful, right? Which is constantly in flux in our culture. It changed something. And it brings me back to, Ken's sort of view of just the microgeny of evolution itself, how every single moment there is a karma and a creativity, right? And there's a choice. Every holon has at every moment a choice between inheriting the karmas from the previous moment, or you have that spark of creativity where you get a chance, an opportunity to create something new. And if that new thing gets selected for, that becomes the karma of the next moment. And this is how things evolve. This is how cultures evolve. This is how individuals evolve. Through these little just opportunities to punctuate our existence with genuine moments of free will and choice. I don't think most of us engage in free will very often at all. I think that 99% of the time we are just following the inertias of our physics, our chemistry, our biology, our psychosocial conditioning, but then you get these opportunities to make a different kind of choice. And for me, these perspectives, I think becoming more familiar with these perspectives expands the range of choices that are available to us at any given moment to both inhabit our reality, and also to enact it in new and novel ways that can hopefully create more meaning for ourselves and for the people around us.
Mm. Hey, Corey, one thing you mentioned there, and I'll just put this as a little footnote for people to pull on the thread later, but maybe think about, we've mentioned this a couple of times, but the Strauss-Howe generational theory, like these big arcing phases that humanity can go through and seem to line up, it's just one offering, but like, I would imagine that if this is kind of thing is true, like what phase humanity is in will change what kind of art we're seeking for various reasons. So like, if we're like people would say we're in most likely the crisis mode right now. So there's unraveling and then crisis, and then you get to, start again, and you can go back in time, like golden periods, things like that. But these days, I'm more interested in something that grounds me. I'm not interested in like art, like Ted Lasso. We talked about Ted Lasso. Yep. That's the kind of thing I'm just like, give me something that just, every day I'm dealing with the news and everything. I just want something simple right now. But in a different period, you start getting an itch, like, let's stir some shit up. We've been complacent for a while. You know what I mean? So like, I think it's really interesting how we relate to that in a bigger meta cycle of art, which is a whole nother probably episode. But like, things you said made.
No, I love it. And in fact, I want to do a future episode, Ryan, Inhabit Your Generation. Let's bring some Gen Xers on. And
that'd be fun.
That out. Bruce, what is your sense? Generational theory, is this largely it feels to me largely zone 7 and zone 4. What we're doing is we're reconstructing average agents, an average sort of sense of what an agent engaging these changing systems, these historically changing systems would look like. And then we're noting how that changes sort of the different permissions and taboos that exist within their cultures. Does that feel right to you?
That does, yeah.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. I like it when things feel right to you because it makes me feel smart.
I think I probably have to go check on my tree guys again, y'all. So but I know we're wrapping up, so I may say goodbye at this moment.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah. Ryan, what I'll do is I'm just going to read through these zone questions again, just to, again, remind our audience of everything we just went through. Bruce, I also want to just take a quick opportunity to thank you. Bruce is raising his hand right now. Yes, Bruce. No, I want to thank you for taking this time to spend with us to talk about this. It's been endlessly fascinating. And I want you to take a moment just to talk about the integral stage.
Yeah, really great having you here, Bruce. I really enjoyed it. Looking forward to next time. I got to take off, y'all. Good to see you.
Thanks, buddy.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, nice to talk with you and to be with you, Corey. And thank you. It's been great to hang out with you. This is our first time to do something like this. I really enjoyed it.
Definitely not our last.
Yeah, great. Yeah, been for 2 years now pushing away at developing the integral stage. And initially the idea for that was to have a place where we could take some of the forum disputes and have a face-to-face encounter and talk about some difficult topics where maybe things could be worked out and maybe contact could be made in ways that were not possible in just the forum space, where there's less signals being exchanged and we don't feel we're as much face-to-face with another individual. But in getting the integral stage rolling, we decided, actually it was me in the beginning, decided I didn't want to jump right out of the gate into something that difficult. So I started just producing other content on, themes and engaging with people who are recognized as, in our community as having something to say, but don't often get put into the media very much. And how can we bring those voices forward and explore intersections of what's going on in the integral community with Metamodern and Game B and Syntheist and other sister and brother communities that are out there that seem to be intuiting a number of the same things, but maybe taking a little bit different track and having different emphases. But what could happen if we begin to synthesize these voices more and bring them into greater dialogue with each other? How can we contribute to our emerging integral moment through that? And so that's pretty much what the integral stage project has become still mostly centering integral voices, but also regularly entering into dialogue with metamodernists or Game B or other kinds of folks around. I think the major themes that are up for the broader meta community. And Layman Pascal is a good dear friend, and he noticed I was not that fluid in terms of interviewing, and he was more loquacious than I am. And he said, I can probably do some of these interviews, and he's done a wonderful job with it, and he's done a lot of the interview content for us. I still, do videos, and I do some interviews and talks, but a lot of my time now is behind the scenes producing the videos.
Yep.
Gradually developing some skills over a couple of years, from really terrible to now mediocre, and I'll keep going. So
I'm loving your graphics these days, man. I told you that a couple days ago. I'm loving the graphics.
Great.
No, and the conversations that you have on the integral stage are just they're so rich, and they're so sort of unabashedly in depth. You're not necessarily trying to break this down for integral newcomers. I mean, these are conversations for and among people who have given this some serious thought, some serious consideration. And I think you're doing such a good job of illuminating this sort of, I'll just call it an integrally adjacent territory that we all share together. I get the same sense that we're all sort of headed in the same direction. We're just kind of taking slightly different paths to get there, and those paths have different emphases from other paths. And in fact, I would suggest folks listen to a conversation we just published with yourself, Rob Smith, and Paul Marshall on Integral Life, where you're actually talking about sort of the big three, integrally adjacent projects that we're trying to coordinate a little bit. That was a really great discussion that got a great response from our audience. So I encourage people to check that out.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, that was a delight to do. And Paul Marshall's doing really great work in that area, exploring those intersections. I've done a little bit, but he's done a lot more in writing his book and some further things after that.
Fantastic. Well, Bruce, thanks again, man. I'm just going to make a quick transition here. I'm just going to read some of these questions again for folks, and then we'll say goodbye. Does that sound good?
Great.
Cool, man. All right. So just for review, here are the 8 perspectives that you can use, in fact, that you probably are already using without knowing it, in order to more fully enact your art and really your world, your life, your relationships, etc. So here they are. In the upper left quadrant, zone 1, the inner of the upper left. What is my immediate in the moment experience of this artwork? What emotional or spiritual states is it evoking for me? Zone 2, the outer of the upper left. What stages, intelligences, typologies, shadows, and other unconscious material is this artwork lighting up within me? In the lower left, the inner of the lower left, zone 3, how are other people experiencing and interpreting this artwork? How do their experiences and interpretations influence my own? How would I respond to this artwork if the artist was standing in front of me right now? Zone 4, which is the outer of the lower left, what are the cultural currents or patterns that this artwork is trying to hold a mirror to? How resonant or subversive is this artwork? Is it playing it safe, or is it pushing the edge? How would this artwork be enacted across multiple different cultures and contexts? Now we go to the upper right quadrant, zone 5, the inner of the upper right. What does this artwork say about the artist's interiors? What meaning can I infer or reconstruct from the text, form, content, etc. of this artwork? Zone 6, which is looking at the upper right quadrant from the outside, the outer of the upper right. What are the most important features, elements, or qualities contained within this artwork? How skilled is the artist, both technically and in creating the desired effect within this artwork? Now we go to the lower right quadrant, the inner of the lower right quadrant, zone 7. What are the conscious and or unconscious social conditions and circumstances surrounding the artist that are embedded in this artwork? And how does that inform the artwork itself? How do my own social circumstances influence my experience and enactment of the artwork? So you're sort of asking both in terms of the artist and in terms of yourself. And then finally, zone 8, which is the outer of the lower right. What kinds of tools, instruments, technologies, etc. made this artwork possible? How successful was this artwork? What kind of behind-the-scenes collaborations made it possible? How does the overall production quality enhance or detract from the transmission of meaning? So those are the 8 zones. They've been tremendously helpful for me over the last few weeks as I've been sort of just opening up some of this material and trying to name some of the simplest versions of these perspectives. I hope it's valuable to you guys at home as well. Yeah, let us know in the comments right down there, wherever you happen to be watching this video on YouTube or Integral Life or what have you. How helpful has this conversation been? What questions do you have that you want us to cover in a future episode? Thanks again for watching. Bruce, thanks again for joining us, brother. And we'll catch you guys next time.
Thank you.